What if everything you believed about this family was a carefully controlled illusion? And what if the biggest twist is only just beginning? Because what is happening right now is something no one saw coming, and it changes everything. So stay with me till the end, because this story flips in a way you will not expect. And if you love shocking reality drama like this, hit subscribe right now and join the fastest growing gossip community so you never miss what happens next. What if everything you thought you understood about a family, about loyalty, about conflict was never the full story? And what if the truth had been quietly waiting beneath the surface for years, slowly building, waiting for the exact moment when silence would finally break? Because for a long time, the narrative seemed simple. There were tensions, there were disagreements, there were moments that felt impossible to repair. And at the center of it all stood a figure who positioned himself as the necessary bridge, the only one capable of holding everything together, the one who translated emotions, managed conflict, and maintained what appeared to be order. But what no one fully realized at the time was how much of that order depended on keeping people apart, on making sure that conversations never happened without filters, that perspectives were never shared without interference, and that misunderstandings were never fully resolved. Because unresolved tension creates dependence, and dependence creates control. And for years, that control remained intact because it was subtle, it was layered, and it was reinforced by a constant stream of small moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but together create a powerful illusion, one that convinced everyone involved that the distance between them was natural, permanent, and impossible to overcome. But illusions have a weakness. They rely on consistency, and the moment that consistency is disrupted, everything begins to shift. And that is exactly what started to happen, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but quietly, gradually, almost invisibly at first, because the most powerful changes rarely announce themselves. They begin in silence, in small, unexpected decisions, in moments where something feels different even if it cannot yet be explained. And for the first time in a very long time, there were conversations happening without supervision, without interruption, and without the familiar voice that had always framed the narrative. And in those conversations, something remarkable began to unfold. Memories that once felt isolated started to connect. Experiences that once seemed unique started to mirror each other. And slowly, piece by piece, a new understanding began to form, one that challenged everything that had been accepted for years. Because when two people begin to compare notes without outside influence, they often discover patterns, and those patterns can be impossible to ignore, especially when they reveal that what once felt like personal conflict may have been something else entirely, something influenced, something encouraged, something shaped over time. And that realization can be both unsettling and empowering. Unsettling because it forces a re-evaluation of the past, and empowering because it opens the door to a different future. And as that door began to open, the dynamic that had once defined everything started to lose its hold, because connection began to replace suspicion, understanding began to replace assumption, and for the first time, there was space for something new, something that had been impossible under the previous structure, something that did not rely on competition or comparison, but instead on shared experience and mutual recognition. And that is where the real shift began, not in public, not in front of an audience, but in those private, unfiltered moments where honesty took the place of performance, and where vulnerability created a bridge that had never been allowed to exist before. And as that bridge grew stronger, it started to influence everything else: decisions, interactions, even the way the future was being imagined. Because once people realize that they are not as divided as they were led to believe, it changes the way they move forward. It changes the way they see themselves, and it changes the way they see each other. And suddenly, the idea that they needed someone else to hold everything together no longer felt true, because they were already doing it themselves without realizing it. And that realization is powerful because it removes the foundation of control. It replaces it with independence. And once independence takes hold, it becomes very difficult to reverse, because it is built on awareness, and awareness cannot be undone. And that is exactly what made this moment so significant, because it was not just about repairing a relationship. It was about redefining an entire dynamic, one that had been in place for decades, one that had shaped identities, influenced choices, and determined the course of countless interactions. And now, for the first time, that dynamic was being questioned, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And clarity has a way of spreading, because once one person begins to see things differently, it often encourages others to do the same. And that ripple effect can transform everything because it creates a new environment, one where old patterns no longer feel necessary and new possibilities begin to emerge. And those possibilities are what make this story so compelling, because they introduce an element of unpredictability, something that was previously absent when everything followed a familiar script. And now that script was being rewritten, not by a single voice, but by multiple perspectives, coming together to form something more balanced, more authentic, and more resilient. And as this transformation continued, it became increasingly clear that the original assumption that everything would fall apart without a central figure was not only inaccurate, but completely reversed. Because instead of collapse, there was growth. Instead of division, there was connection. And instead of dependency, there was strength. And that strength was not loud or aggressive. It was steady, it was confident, and it was rooted in the understanding that they no longer needed to compete for space or recognition because they were no longer operating within the same limitations. And that is where the tension begins to shift, because when control is challenged, it often leads to resistance, attempts to reframe the situation, to reinterpret the changes in a way that restores the original narrative. But those attempts become less effective when the people involved have already experienced something different. Because once you have seen an alternative, once you have felt what it is like to operate outside of a controlled dynamic, it becomes very difficult to accept the old version of reality. And that is exactly what creates the next phase of the story, a phase where the contrast between past and present becomes impossible to ignore, where actions speak louder than explanations, and where the direction of the future becomes increasingly clear, even if it is not yet fully defined. And that is what keeps everything moving forward, because the story is no longer about what was, it is about what is becoming. And what is becoming is something that no one originally predicted, something that challenges expectations and reshapes perceptions, and invites everyone watching to reconsider what they thought they understood. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that follow a straight path, but the ones that take unexpected turns, the ones that reveal hidden layers, and the ones that remind us that even the most established dynamics can change when the right conditions are finally met. And that is exactly where this journey truly begins, not at the height of conflict, but at the moment of realization, the moment when everything starts to make sense in a new way, and the moment when the future becomes something entirely different from the past. As this new understanding continued to take shape, it did not remain hidden for long, because shifts in energy have a way of revealing themselves through actions, through choices, and through the subtle but undeniable change in how people show up in each other's lives. And what started as quiet conversations soon began to influence real-world decisions, decisions that carried weight and meaning, decisions that signaled something far more significant than anyone on the outside could have predicted. Because this was no longer just about revisiting the past, it was about actively choosing a different future, one that was no longer bound by old expectations or limited by outdated roles. And as these choices became more visible, they began to challenge the long-standing assumptions that had defined the entire dynamic for years. Because the idea that everything would fall apart without a central guiding force was slowly being replaced by a new reality, one where stability was being created organically through mutual respect and shared understanding. And that reality was not only surprising, it was deeply unsettling for anyone who had relied on the old structure to maintain a sense of control. Because control depends on predictability, and predictability was disappearing with every passing moment. And in its place was something far more difficult to manage, something fluid, something independent, something that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. And as this transformation unfolded, there were attempts to interpret it through the lens of the past, to frame it as temporary or strategic or even performative. But those interpretations began to lose credibility as more evidence emerged that what was happening was genuine. Because authenticity has a distinct presence, it cannot be manufactured.
Over time, it reveals itself in consistency, in the way people interact when they believe no one is watching, in the way they support each other without expectation, and in the way they navigate challenges without reverting to old patterns. And those were exactly the signs that started to appear, not in grand gestures, but in small, meaningful moments that carried more weight than any public statement ever could. And as those moments accumulated, they began to form a narrative of their own, one that stood in direct contrast to everything that had been previously believed. Because instead of conflict,
everything else shapes the way stories are told, the way actions are interpreted, and the way the future is anticipated. And as this new perception takes hold, it creates opportunities that align with the current reality rather than the past one. Opportunities that further reinforce the independence and strength of the individuals involved. And those opportunities, in turn, contribute to a cycle of growth, one that continues to build upon itself and expand into new areas, creating a sense of forward movement that is both exciting and unpredictable. And that unpredictability is what keeps the story engaging, because it introduces the possibility of outcomes that were previously unimaginable. Outcomes that challenge expectations and redefine what is considered possible. And as this phase of the journey unfolds, it becomes clear that the transformation is not a single event, but an ongoing process, one that continues to develop and reveal new dimensions over time. And that process is what sustains the narrative, because it ensures that there is always another layer to uncover, another perspective to consider, and another moment that adds depth to the overall story. And as each of those moments emerges, they contribute to a larger picture, one that reflects not just change, but evolution, a progression from a state of limitation to a state of expansion. And that progression is what ultimately defines the significance of what is happening, because it demonstrates that even the most deeply ingrained dynamics can shift when the right conditions are met, when awareness replaces assumption, and when connection replaces division. And that is what brings everything to this point, a point where the past no longer dictates the future, where the narrative is no longer controlled by a single voice, and where the direction of the story is shaped by those who are actively living it and redefining it in real time. And that is where the true impact lies, not in what has already happened, but in what continues to unfold, because the journey is far from over, and the next chapter is already beginning to take shape in ways that promise to push the story even further beyond anything that was originally imagined. And just like that, everything changed. Not with chaos, but with clarity, proving that the real power was never where we thought it was. And this story is far from over. So if you want the real inside tea before everyone else, make sure you hit subscribe right now and join the fastest growing channel, because the next twist is going to be even bigger.